Okay, good afternoon. This is Richard Hsu, host of Hsu Untied. Today I'm really thrilled and honored to have with me as my guest April Rinne, who's a keynote speaker, best-selling author. April, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much, Richard. I'm delighted to be here.
Now, April, as you know, I interview a lot of lawyers and former lawyers, and I noticed you went to law school yourself and even worked as a lawyer. Maybe start by telling me how you started down this path, or how does one go from being a lawyer to a keynote speaker and best-selling author?
Yeah, well, great kickoff question. I'll try to keep it brief, but it is a bit of a longer-ish, it's a meandering answer, but I think it'll tie a lot of different things together.
Sure.
Well, I should start by saying I never saw myself going to law school or being a lawyer. I grew up not knowing a single lawyer. It wasn't even part of my world. I loved math and science and global diversity, and I was going to be a doctor, and then I was going to be an architect, and all these different things. But when I was in college, and I know I'm bringing up a pretty sensitive topic straight away, but I want to be clear. I want to talk about, I welcome conversations about this. When I was a junior in college, both of my parents died in a car crash. And I say this because I know this will come up later, like change and uncertainty and what do you do when your world flips upside down and how to think and look at life differently. And for me, everything changed at age 20, like my family, my sense of self, my career. And I started to ask a very different kind of question about my own mortality and my own purpose. And also, you go through something like a dual vehicular homicide, you can't not come in touch with the law. And so as a young person, I had a crash course in the legal system, effectively as a victim of it. But very personal. And as a result of that, I have one older sister, and she and I had to go through this ordeal, just trying to figure out what happened. That was all we wanted, was a sense of closure. And I'll spare you the details of that, all of that case, but it was a bit of a soap opera. It was a drama. It was all kinds of evidence and criminal law 101. And I realized how empowering a law degree was. And the lawyers that represented us, my sister and me, two young adults, changed my life. And it made me realize, oh my goodness, my life experience now becomes my life work. Now, I want nothing to do with the courtroom. I do not want litigation. I do not want criminal law. But I've always been interested in economics and economic development and business. And I think I'm supposed to go to law school to help create the kinds of situations that keep people from courtrooms. I bring this up because I ended up doing a joint degree. I knew it wasn't just law, and I didn't think it was law firms. It wasn't just law. I was interested in economic development. I was interested in global diversity. I was interested in sustainable and inclusive business. And so I did a joint degree focusing on law and economic development, international business. And that led me to do all kinds of interesting things within the legal community. And I'll never forget, it was my mentors in the global development community who said, the best thing you can do is go work at a law firm, learn how to run deals, and then come back speaking the language that will allow you to have greater impact. So that's what I did at two different law firms, at Allen & Overy and O'Melveny. And I call them both out because they were both great places. I loved my time at law firms. And both of these places allowed me to pursue a broader interest, not just in financial law and corporate law and banking law, but in impact investing and social sector finance law. So I got to launch new initiatives and new practice areas, focused not just on making a bunch of money, but actually transactions that had social impact as well. I share all of this because then I left the law firm as soon as I knew I had enough skills to go make this bigger impact. So I did that. And then one thing led to another. And I ended up getting involved in all kinds of different innovations and different developments with technology and small business and global development and emerging markets. And then as part of that, today, most people know me as a futurist, as well as an author and a speaker. But as part of, I was starting to connect many different dots. And I think that's what a lot of my career has been. Not in one vertical, not as an expert in one sector, but taking skills and saying, those can be helpful over here. And then doing that for a while and then saying, but now I see a problem over there that can can help be addressed, and then going over there for a while. And all of that ultimately led to a kind of pattern finding where I was seeing patterns between sectors, patterns between cultures, patterns between very unrelated things that could be helped by the same phenomenon. Now, I bring this up because the defining theme of my entire career, when I look back on it now, 30 years later, is change and uncertainty. And how do we approach things that we don't understand? What is our relationship to the unknown? What is our relationship to what's unfamiliar? A lot of that goes back to what I experienced losing my parents, but what I've seen in the years since in lots of different businesses. So that transition, I didn't set out to be an author. I didn't set out to be a speaker. But what I did set out to do is have as much impact today as I possibly can, knowing that I might die tomorrow, kind of thing. Not to sound morbid, but that this question of, if I were to die tomorrow, what does the world need me to do today? And it's led me to make very atypical decisions about my career, but also to see it more holistically, not as something that it's not a ladder that I'm going to climb. It's going to be more of a portfolio that I curate, and we can come back to that theme as well. But that's kind of how it evolved. But the fact that I love my time in the law, and I feel deeply committed to the future of law and the legal practice and profession. I just don't need to be drafting the contracts.
Yeah, interesting. Well, tell me a little about some of the dots that you're connecting, and what are some of the patterns? Give me some examples of the kinds of things you're connecting together.
Yeah, well, I think these days, the easiest, biggest, the probably lowest hanging fruit one is the global pattern. I use the term pattern in this context quite judiciously. The pattern of how humans the world over really struggle with change. We are really bad at it on the whole. And I have to clarify too, because I hear from people almost every day and they're saying, I love change. I'm a change junkie. And I'm always like, hold on a minute, like, hang tight. Humans generally, and we can debate this if you want, it's super fun to sort of pull on this thread because it's not one that people talk about that often, and yet it underscores and girds and drives so much else. Humans tend to love the kinds of change they can control. Change you opt into. I'm going to take a new job. I'm going to take a new trip. I'm going to get a new haircut. I'm going to forge a new relationship. Those are all changes that we love because we're opting in. Very few humans, I'm still looking for that human that loves the change that blindsides you, the change that flips your world upside down, the change that you didn't see coming and it disrupts your plans and, right? The stuff that we feel fearful and anxious about, the stuff that we resist and deny and pretend it didn't happen and create all kinds of problems for ourselves and others. That's the kind of change that I'm really interested in. And that's really what underscores a lot of my work on this concept in this book of Flux. And so the pattern of how, on the one hand, humans the world over struggle with change they don't control, the change they don't want to have happen. That is one kind of pattern. But on the flip side, another kind of pattern that I've seen that I love and that I'm digging even deeper into these days is that there are so many, the pattern of seeing just how many different, distinct, unique, beautiful ways and traditions of wisdom. So think words, vocabulary, concepts, rituals, traditions that humans have evolved over human history to navigate the unknown. Every culture throughout time immemorial has struggled with change and developed some kind of concept or ritual or tradition or word about change. And it's fascinating because we are sitting on so much human wisdom when it comes to these things we struggle with, but by and large, we haven't connected these dots. So one of the things that I get to do is connect these dots. And that's why, I think we were chatting earlier, like my entire career has been global. it hasn't been domestic placed. Even in my book, we have like 34 different cultures that are in that, but I've got an inventory of hundreds and hundreds of these concepts and traditions from all over the world, from developed countries, emerging countries, a lot of indigenous wisdom, a lot of ancient philosophy and principles that in modern day we've often forgotten or never knew were there. And yet you start digging in and you're like, oh my gosh, the answers that we're looking for, they're actually right in front of us. We just have to adjust our mindset for how we're thinking about and relating to and seeing change itself.
So give me an example of something about how we have these tools that are not being used to deal with change. Give me some examples or historical examples.
So then we're going to get into a little bit of, well, I kind of need to explain a little bit of the framework for how I see these things, because there are different ways, different aspects of change. You know, one is our relationship to control and different themes about control. Another big theme is trust. And what I've discovered in my research and observations and whatnot, if you look at what helps an individual or what helps a society navigate change well over time, what are the factors that drive that? At the end of the day, no single factor, as far as I can tell, matters more than trust. And think about trust on many different levels. Can you trust someone else? Can you trust yourself? Can you trust that the sun is going to rise tomorrow? Can you trust that if you're going through a difficult time and you don't know what to do, that you're not always going to feel that way? Can you trust that something's on the horizon for you, right? And these are different aspects. Another aspect I should definitely mention today, and brings me to an interesting cultural example, is the pace of change, right? That change isn't happening in a vacuum. And you've probably heard like the pace of change is getting faster. The way I like to frame it is, and we can debate whether is there more change or less change, like there's always been change. What is clear is that thanks to technology and other forces, but technology plays a really important role, the amount of change that we are aware of on any given day is dramatically increasing, right? There's always been lots of change, but you weren't necessarily aware of a natural disaster halfway around the world or changing government, wherever. You had a much smaller nexus of change. The human brain is not designed to process that many different data points around change, especially when so many of them are the change you don't control, the change we struggle with, right? It just hijacks your brain and sends it into this downward spiral. And so the way I like to think of it is that the pace of change has never been as fast as it is today, and yet it is likely to never again be this slow. So when you think about that, if you're struggling today, what are you planning for tomorrow? And this gets us into the space of what I call in my book, the different superpowers for navigating change. There are 8 of them that I've identified, and we can head into them if you'd like. But one of them is very much attached to this idea of pace of change. And when you think about what society typically tells us, society typically says, when the pace of change quickens, I might even ask you, what are we supposed to do? We're supposed to run faster and keep up, right? Now, play this out. Like, pause or play this out. If you're telling me that however fast I'm running today, and let's just say I happen to feel exhausted, right? I'm like, plenty of change, like slow down. You're telling me, not you, but society is telling us that however fast you're running today, that not only should you expect to run faster, but that you should run faster tomorrow, the next day, and next week, next month. Like, wait a minute. How is that possibly a recipe for human flourishing? We've got it completely backwards. And so, coming to your question, give me an example, because again, it's not related to all of change. It's related to the pace of change. In the Netherlands, the Dutch have this concept, which I love. It's called Niksen, Niksen. Niksen means, well, technically it means do nothing. It is all about a societally accepted and celebrated ability to slow down. The Dutch actually understand that running faster not only means that you miss the best parts of life, it actually means you can't see what's really happening. You have no ability to replenish, and you end up making foolish decisions. And you end up making mistakes that then take you more time and more money to go fix, et cetera, et cetera. And so one of my superpowers is this notion of, in order to thrive in a world in flux and amidst constant change and uncertainty, we have to learn how to run slower, not run faster. And what's an example of that? Nixon. But again, it's not that these concepts cover every aspect of change. This one's about pace. There are other ones about trust, other ones about control, and so forth.
How did you as I'm listening to you talk about this, I'm curious to know, did most of this come to you like in one, bolt of lightning, or how did you even come up with this idea or this approach, or you just, or was it more evolutionary? Give me some of the highlights maybe of how this came to you.
Yeah, so definitely not a bolt of lightning, if only. And also I can say, like, genuinely, it only came through time and doing the work and paying attention and taking good notes. And what's interesting, Richard, is that, I mean, honestly, for 20 years at least, people were saying, oh, you should write a book. And I was like, no, absolutely not. And going back to that question that I asked, like, if I were to die tomorrow, what would the world need for me to do today? I could never answer that the world needed me to write a book. Like, the world doesn't need another book per se. And often my friends and colleagues that wanted me to write a book, they thought I should write a travel book, because separate conversation, but I've lived overseas for about 15 years. I spent 4 years, though, in between college and law school, actually, without a permanent address. I had a backpack and a shoestring budget, and I researched and guided hiking and biking trips in order to earn enough money to travel the rest of the year. But my goal was to learn how as much of the rest of the world live as I could, so that I could better understand how to serve. And to serve those who hadn't had, I mean, yes, I had experienced tragedy, but I had the privilege of an education. I had the privilege of being healthy. I also had this existential fear that I was going to die tomorrow. And I knew that if I died tomorrow, I did not understand enough of the world. And it was my responsibility as a citizen of the world to forge a career that would help others. So I share this because, like, when I go back, when did I start seeing this? It was already back then. And the base was, I think, really late. When my parents died, that just ruptured everything in terms of, like, my ability to trust, my ability, like, I started on this personal quest to better understand, what in the world are we here for? And the joke is, and it's a serious joke, but many years later, I will often say, I did go through a kind of the equivalent of a sort of midlife crisis when I was 20. Now, I wasn't in midlife and I didn't ask for it, but I realized I started asking those kinds of questions. And then I've been practicing asking those questions for a very long time. But along the way, and even, prior to my parents' deaths or anything like that, my dad was a cultural geographer, meaning that he studied maps and plants and people and diversity. And I grew up in an environment in which that was celebrated. And he would always say to me, the more different someone is from you, the more interesting they are to get to know, and the more you have to learn from them. And so that seed was planted really young.
Interesting.
And I kind of went on this quest of, like, well, who's more different? I want to get to know them. And so, as you might imagine, these concepts, even though I had a book was nowhere on my radar, these concepts started trickling in, and I was taking notes. I've always kept journals and that sort of thing. So, like, by the time I came to write the book, like, 80% of my research was done, but it'd been done over years and decades. And then there was this moment, though, after resisting writing a book, largely because I didn't want to write it to tick some box or because other people thought I should write it. I wanted to be able to write something from the heart if that were to ever come to pass. And I still remember it was 2014. And I was talking to a friend about this recently because they were like, when did you have this idea? And I said, well, 2014, I remember the day. It wasn't that anything in particular had happened, but I remember distinctly where I was and waking up and being like, oh my goodness, there is a book coming out of me and I can't not write it. And what's lovely is it's a very different dynamic, because it wasn't about, I need to do this because I need to meet someone else's metrics of success. It was if I could finally answer the question, I think what it was is, to your question about like, how did this happen? I had been drip feeding and paying attention and taking enough notes that there came a moment when I realized that, again, not to sound morbid, if I were to die tomorrow, the best thing I could do today was capture these ideas and these patterns and these insights and share this abundant human wisdom from all over the world, that would be what I wanted to leave behind.
Yeah, right.
And when that became clear, it was like, oh, gotta write it, gotta do it now. Now, of course, it took many more years for it to come fully to fruition, but that's how it happened. It was very small, but I think too, there's a quote by Mary Oliver, and it's not that long, so I apologize, I'm probably gonna botch it, but it's like, instructions for living a life. Pay attention, be astonished, tell about it. And I think that's what it was for me. I had been paying attention, very aware of my own existential mortality. I had been taking notes, being astonished by it. And then I was like, I gotta share, I gotta tell about it.
Mm-hmm. So I take it, I mean, I'm assuming that if you hadn't had this, obviously a tragic change foisted upon you, let's just say, you probably wouldn't have set you down this path. I guess I'm just wondering, I assume you attribute a lot of this, it was such a pivotal event. Not just that it got you to law school, but also it really started getting you thinking about this whole thing, about the scariness of change and how it can really upend your life when you're not in control.
Yes, and because I get this not flavor, it's a question that I grapple with a lot. And how it used to manifest was, well, fine, you carved out this different career path because you went through tragedy, you learned to see something different. Right. Is it possible to do this, to have this change of mindset without some kind of tragedy, some kind of wake up, right?
Yeah. And
I refuse. Now, in my case, tragedy and experience can be definitely a wake up. It can be an expediter. Mm-hmm. But I refuse to believe that it's only tragedy that allows, that nudges people to do this sort of thing. My answer is always, anyone can choose to do this. Doing it without tragedy is actually a lot more enjoyable.
Yeah, sure.
For the record.
Yeah.
But I also want to tease out, and this is where it gets really interesting with the last few years, right? And the pandemic and so forth, that I've had some people also think that like this work on Flux, that it was like my pandemic project. And I'm like, no, not at all. I've been beating this drum for a really long time. The last few years have been an incredible validation and a kind of petri dish to showcase just how badly we need to improve our relationships to change. Yeah. But also, I just want to tease out, over the last few years, I think it's a very safe bet to say every person on the planet in some way, shape, or form, directly or indirectly, has had a bit of a wake up. And again, I'm not going to say what every person's exactly was, but we've all been shook by the capacity for what could be, the capacity for what could happen in really scary ways and in really uplifting ways. And so, yes, and this is just my story, but I'm very aware this isn't a story I tell because of me. It's a tool that connects to other people, because I'm very aware that every single person has had to deal with change and uncertainty, or they will have to deal with it at some point in their life. And this whole notion of like, everyone's experience of change is different, but everyone can use some help with change. Like, I haven't found anybody who's like, tick that box, like nailed it and moved on. Because all you have to do is wait for something else to change. And you'll find yourself, struggling in some other
well, that's what I was going to say, is that, that's probably what's resonated a lot with your readers and your audience, I'm guessing, is that everyone can relate to change that they're not in control of. That happens probably every single day, really. Something, you wake up in the morning, you don't know what's going to happen. And sometimes it's tragic, like in your case, other times, but there's always something that's changing. And
what I hear all the time too, is it's like, I will not profess to be like, these aren't my ideas at all. Like, these are timeless principles that are very timely today. And my contribution isn't that like oh, I came up with this new, like silver bullet to deal with change.
Yeah.
What I'm most interested in is weaving together all of these different threads and insights and tradition, and to do so looking back, but also looking forward, because people know me primarily as a futurist. And here's another interesting angle, maybe that it does make sense to mention right now.
Yeah.
On a more modern day, I can talk about I'm not an anthropologist, but I love the cultural stuff, and it's very human and it's very relatable in some capacity because we're all human.
Yeah.
But also, as a futurist, I continue to get pulled into conversations in organizations that were about change management and our change management strategy. And with all due respect, change management is a useful tool. I'm not going to discount that. I am, however, going to say that change management in its traditional conception is woefully outdated for today's world. It's incomplete. And what I mean by that is, even by its back to language, change management, by the words we're using, we are assuming that we can manage change, we can engineer it. Change happens. Okay, fine. We're going to react. We're going to put it back in its box, tick that box, and move on. And yet, think about how the world really works, Richard, right? That you don't just manage change and move on. And what we're all looking at is a future in which there is more of the change and instability and uncertainty and ambiguity and unfamiliarity, the things we can't control, than less. And yet we're still trying to slap these outdated models on. And what became really clear to me was that we were over-indexing on change management and spreadsheets and flowcharts and, put this all in a box. And what we weren't talking about is how a given change makes us feel. And I know this is where I love, because in the law, friends of mine who don't know that I was a lawyer and then meet me and learn that I was a lawyer, they're like, you're like the anti-lawyer, and not anti-law, but they're like, what you're saying is just so at odds with the law. And what I love about this, they're partially right. It's not any kind of disrespect to the law. It was my time in the law really underscored how much we weren't seeing, how much we think that if we put something in a contract, we're boom, done, button it down, tick that box, move on. There's very little space for human emotion in the law, in contracts, at least, right? In business law. And yet we're not talking about how we feel about change, but also in particular, we're not talking about our mindset about change. And we're not talking about whether you're seeing a given change, for example, from a place of hope or fear. Now, that one question would be deemed kind of woo-woo in negotiations or whatever. That answer will fundamentally drive and determine and shape and color whatever strategy you set, whatever change you try to manage, but even, how good your contract's going to be. And we're not talking about those kinds of conversations. And so part of what I'm trying to do too is reverse engineer that and stop putting that cart before the horse. And so there's a real humanity in it, but it also is related to the law. I saw a lot of design flaws, if you will, within the legal profession.
Well, one of the nice things, the interesting thing about your whole theory or thesis, I should say, about change is that it is really equally, and I'm going to speculate this, but I'm sure it's the case, that it's equally applicable to the corporate world and to the personal world, right? I mean, it happens. Businesses have to deal with it. Executives have to deal with it. And then, but in a personal way, you have to deal with it too in your personal life. So it has this broad applicability. I'm figuring that's what you.
Yeah. And I love that you picked this up. Very much true. And it's funny because even the book is technically a business book,
right?
But I'm walking a very fine line with, and it's funny, some people call it self-help or personal growth. The fact is, and again, personally, professionally, organizationally, societally, some people might even say civilizationally, it's flux.
Right.
And I'm not going to guess what changes you're dealing with. I'm not going to judge what change, none of that. But think about the personal growth. Think about professionally as an individual, your career, professional development, etc. Organizationally, think culture, think talent, think technology. Societally, democracy in flux, markets in flux, like take your pick. And so wherever you are, pick the thing you're grappling with, it can still be helpful. And I love that. And one thing I will say, and it's become even clearer as I get feedback and hear from people and whatnot, and I knew this at the beginning, but I think now I can say so even with greater confidence, particularly the piece between personal, professional, organizational. We talk about professional development a lot. I can't at this point extract that from personal growth. You can't have the professional development if you're not doing some work on your own personal development and self-awareness and so forth. And so it really is this inside out approach to change. You've got to start by you. But what's lovely is when you do that work on self-awareness and your relationship to change, I can guarantee you everything that you do is going to turn out a bit better. You get clarity professionally and you show up even better, more fully within your organization. And so for leaders, it's funny because there have been CEOs that get interested in the book for, again, strategy and leadership and that sort of thing. HR is really about, team well-being and organizational culture and all of that. And it's also one of those themes. I will often say this, like in my talks, I'm like, listen, I don't know what part of this is going to resonate most with you, but I want you to think about, hopefully, even if you don't find something that you can apply in your workplace today, I hope you find something you can apply to your family, to your friends. And often what I have is people read the book and they come to me, they're like, my spouse really needs to read your book, or my kids, or whatever. And that's gratifying because it is very universal in that regard.
Have you ever thought about how, what I really like hearing your story is how, you've developed a message that really has incorporated all the different experiences in your life. It's not just the tragedy of your parents, but there's the law school, there's the fact that your dad was this historian and you had that kind of growing up in your family, and somehow you weaved all this together into a message. And that doesn't happen to people very often. And you're kind of, do you ever think about how fortunate you are that this all kind of came together and you actually have a nice message that you can actually bring to the world?
Oh yeah, well, first of all, gratitude. Thank you, Richard. I get all, oh my gosh, when I hear thank you. I appreciate this a lot. And I will say I'm keenly aware of the gratitude. I'm keenly aware of the privilege of getting to think about, getting to share a message. I'm keenly aware, and I do like to just say, it didn't just come to me. What you're saying, isn't it? I'm like, yes, it's wonderful. And guess what? It took 30 years. I'm also aware if all of this had happened in the last 18 months, I'd be like, whoa, what's she taking? Give me some of that. Right? It's not that. Or what kind of lottery did she win? I've been pulling on these threads, and what I feel profoundly grateful for is that it's funny, it's art and science, right? Where I could say the stars align, right? I could say all of those times pounding the pavement and trying to connect those dots and trying to it all started to make sense, right? And that's not, there is both art and science. But yes, I am aware. And I think for me, what is super important is that I wanted to create a message and create a body of work that it's by me, and there's a piece of it. It's hard for me to get to the message without sharing a piece of my story, but it's not about me. It's about this message for humanity. It's about something we can all relate to. My story happens to just help get the door open, and it helps to allow people feel comfortable. And, it's certainly, I had to be vulnerable to do that, but I also want to be able to model, if we can't be vulnerable, all of us, then we have a much harder time at human connection. We have a much harder time at building self-awareness. We have a much harder time at showing up for one another. And so it allows me to do that. But then it is the time, the years I spent as a lawyer, the years I spent in business. I joke that in addition to dot connector, a lot of what I do, it's like I'm a translator. And it took me many, many years to, figuratively speaking, learn how to speak these different languages. You speak legalese, and you speak finance talk, and you speak, I'm a yoga teacher, so I speak yoga. I don't teach in the studio, but yoga philosophy shows up in a lot of what I do. That takes time to learn to speak those different languages. But then once you can actually translate those messages, it gets really exciting, because my goals are to meet as many people where they are on their terms, and to provide something of help and utility, and hopefully, empathy and grace that can help them a little bit moving forward. So, yeah.
Well, April, I really appreciate your taking time. I loved hearing your story. It's a wonderful message, and I really appreciate your taking the time.
Thank you, Richard. It's been a pleasure, and thank you for hosting me.
This is Richard Hsu and April Rinne.